is called Finding Yourself Over and Over Again, and I had a really interesting / rough few years once I had my daughter, and you'll hear all about that. And I really sort of feel like the core to success in life in general is actually just understanding who you are and how you relate to the world versus trying to adhere to some other prescribed idea of who you think you should be or what success is. So a lot of the talk is going to be about that. A lot of lectures start off with a section in which someone says who they are and who am I and why am I here and whatnot. So I will tell you a little bit about who I am and the ways in which I started discovering who I was over the course of my life. One of the first things I found out as a small child was that I was an Aries. There's so many things that we learn about ourselves over the course of our lives, and a lot of ancillary tests and all sorts of things that try to tell us about who we are and who we're going to be. And finding out that I was an Aries, specifically because I was born in April, was something that was interesting to me. And I was a very different person as a small child than I am right now. If you've met me any time in the last few years, you know that I'm very much a people person, that I love interacting with people, that I'm like extroverted to the point of it being a problem, where I'm the last person to leave a party ever. You have to like usher me out with the janitors and things like that. When you guys all come to the Bay Area, I will bring you to the Kona Club, which is a tiki bar in Oakland that I'm obsessed with, and I make everyone come to with me. But as a kid, I was just painfully shy. I was a very shy kid. I was a crier and very sensitive, just in a very huge way. I have a really clear memory of being in like 4th or 5th grade and walking up to my teacher's desk like in tears because I couldn't find my pencil that turned out to be tucked behind my ear. And the idea of being an Aries, which is this like fiery personality that's really strong and stubborn, just seemed so foreign to me as a small kid. And I feel like I've only like come into my Ariesness as an adult. So who knows if it's woo-woo or real. I don't know if anybody was born in the 80s or 90s, but if you were, you probably are familiar with this book of birthdays because everybody had an aunt that had it. It's always an aunt. And at your aunt's house, over whatever holiday it was, you all would analyze everyone in your lives' birthdays, and then when you were 12 or 13, you would start investigating every boy or girl that you were interested in to see how they paired up with you and blah, blah, blah. And so my April 4th description was, very aligned with Ariesness, but, just sort of, again, taking in this information, trying to be like, does this agree or not agree with who I am, what I am? Maybe this is me, I don't know. Is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? Who knows? The next thing was there was a Chinese restaurant in my hometown. My hometown was not a particularly ethnically diverse hometown, being from northeast Pennsylvania in an anthracite coal region. But this Chinese restaurant had this exact same placemat which showed all the Chinese zodiac on it, and I was Year of the Rat. And the only thing I really garnered from this was that Year of the Rat and Year of the Horse people do not get along, and my mom was a Year of the Horse, so I just took it as fuck you, Mom, we're never gonna get along. That was very handy in the 13 to 20 age range, but my mom's amazing, whatever, who cares? Have you guys heard about this thing called love languages? Does everyone know their love languages? I've actually, this is a recent thing and it seems like, okay, whatever, roll your eyes, but I found this to be outrageously helpful for some relationships in my life where I couldn't understand why, certain family members or friends would get so hung up about me being a couple days late on giving their birthday gift to them, or how they would feel the need to explain to me almost in exact terms of what they spent on a gift for me. And then once I read through the love languages, I was like, oh, their love language is gifts. I was like, that makes so much sense. They're not just a bunch of materialistic crazy people. And so these are my love languages, just so everyone knows. I am an ENFJ on the Myers-Briggs. If you are from the Bay Area, you probably know your Myers-Briggs very well. It's definitely conversation fodder for everyone that lives in California. I don't know if it extends very far past California in terms of it being a thing that you talk about at bars, but it definitely is a big thing there. And my friend Justin told me he heard a joke that Myers-Briggs is astrology, but for people with LinkedIn profiles. And I was like, that's a dope joke. Thank you, Justin. And then on the Enneagram, does anyone know their Enneagram number? This is like another thing, a 2, yeah. Hello, number 2. I'm also a 2. 2 means you're a helper, and when you're a helper, it basically means you can't not be the person that sees someone that seems lost on the subway platform, and you're like, let me follow you for the rest of the day to make sure that you end up where you're supposed to be. And it's like, again, a thing that is really, can be really wonderful, but is also a thing that can be very crippling when you let it get out of control. So from 2007 to 2012, I lived in New York. I went to school in Philly, but then I moved to New York in 2007 to work for Louise Feely. I did not want to move to New York. I thought I was going to live in Philadelphia for the rest of my life and be a freelance illustrator and live that freelance life, and it would be great. Now I'm living that freelance life, except in a city in which like the median home price is like $1.4 million, which is very different than Philadelphia, as you could imagine. But that time in New York was so special and so formative to me, and also like so devastating and so weird at the same time. New York, if anybody has ever lived there, like retrains you to live your life in a very different way. I think actually that's where a lot of my Aries and a lot of my, needing to be a very like forward, action item person came. And it's because to be social in New York, you have to assume that you're always invited everywhere that you go. Like nobody's gonna invite you because they're gonna assume that you're doing other things or that you're working on a Friday night or whatever, and you'll get to work on Monday and everybody will be like, how come you weren't at Jane's birthday party? And you're like, Jane had a birthday party? And so anytime that you hear about anything, you have to just be like, I'm supposed to be here, they just forgot to invite me. And if you can live your life that way, which New York trains you to do if you live a successful life in New York, it makes you a very different social creature in every other city that you live in. And it also means that anytime you go to a small town, you don't quite understand how deep of a hang you are in with everyone that you meet. When I first moved to San Francisco, if you went out for drinks with people after work and didn't have explicit dinner plans with someone else, you were basically hanging out with them for 8 hours. And that's like not a New York thing. It's like, hour and a half tops, and everybody moves on to their next event, whatever. But it was really great. I worked for Louise, and I learned so much while I was working for her. I did a lot of logotypes. I did a lot of book covers and book interiors. And I was always really interested in lettering even when I was in college. I didn't really know that's what it was, though. And even while I was working with Louise, I didn't understand that it was its own industry. And while I was working for her, I was doing just a ton of freelance lettering and illustration on the side, and just being able to sort of hone that skill during the day, but in a very, very different way, and then work on very different projects at night, meant that I was this like crazy 16-hour workday workaholic, and it was really exciting. Like when people ask me, how do you avoid creative burnout and still get a lot done, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to people is that if you're working on things in the evening, they have to be really different than the work that you do during the day, so that it doesn't feel like one continuous 16-hour day. It needs to feel like different shifts. And I still do that with the way that I work, throughout my day now. Like if I have sketches to do or if I have writing to do, I do it in a really different environment than I do my other work, which makes me feel like I have a lot of really small jobs instead of one really long job. And at the time, my work-life balance was less like work-life and was more work-life. And I loved it. If you read interviews from me in like 2008, I'm just like, I don't understand why people feel the need to separate work and life. It's awesome to just work all the time and have life all the time. It's great. And when I met my husband, I met him through Match.com when it was still weird to meet people on the internet. And he was just like, why are you always going to these work parties all the time? Like, don't you ever just want to like live your life and have fun? And I was like, these are my life. The AIGA events are my social life. And I get really like crazy when people suggest that people don't go to industry events and things like that, because I do find them so enriching and so helpful to just be around other people that are interested in what you're doing and being able to geek out with you over the same stuff that we geek out about. So if you had asked me at the time, who am I would have led with the description of myself as a working person, which would have been, I'm a design illustrator or an I don't know, whatever other combination of words I would have added at the time. but it would have been all about like what I'm doing for a living and way less about who I am as a person, because what I did for a living was basically who I was as a person at that time in my life. And it's just because I'd never had a lot of time to really figure myself out, other than thinking about all these personality quizzes that I did or did not agree with in terms of how it related to me. So, and I think a lot of it, I had this sort of epiphany, like maybe last year, that so much of this stems from this question, what are you working on? So in New York, like when you're at a party or something like that, and you see a friend, a dear friend that you've known for a long time, you run into them and they go, hey, what are you working on? What have you been working on lately? How's it going? And it's one of the first questions that you get asked. And then when you're asked that question, every single time that you see people, you always want to have a really good answer. So I think that knowing that you're going to go into a social situation and people are going to ask you about the work that you're doing really changes how you approach the work that you're doing, making sure that you do always have an interesting answer to that, because it's really embarrassing to not have an interesting answer. And then so in 2012, when I moved to the Bay Area, the question changed like crazy. So all of a sudden, it went from what are you working on to how are you? And that seems like such a non-thing, like it seems so small. But for months and months, maybe even the first 2 or 3 years that I lived there, people would ask me, how are you? And I would go forward with, oh, I'm great, I'm working on this thing for blah, blah, blah. And I would start talking about the things that I was working on, but that's not what they were asking me. And in a way, like I would leave that conversation being like, oh God, I just felt like I was so braggy. I felt like I just said something I wasn't supposed to say, blah, blah, blah. And it's because I didn't know like how I was other than how I was in terms of how I related to my work. And then so I noticed that in San Francisco, away from New York, all of a sudden work life became work life. And part of that was just because so many of the friends that I were meeting worked at tech companies and worked in places where they were putting in a 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. And then in the evenings, they would go out and hang out with their friends, which was very different than my life in New York. I think that workaholism really served me well early on in my career, but there's a reason why I basically had bronchitis for like 3 years in a row. And it was just because I was working way too hard. And it's just such a thing that people get accustomed to, and it's a thing that invades so many businesses, is this idea of what productivity is or what a good amount of working hours are. And I really had to reframe that when I moved to a new city and was surrounded by people that didn't randomly work on Friday and Saturday and Sunday all the time. They did sometimes, but only because they had to, not because they wanted to. And in a way, like I really missed being surrounded by people that had that workaholism and that had that like passion for all this side stuff. But I sort of was at the time in my life where I needed a little bit of an adjustment, and I was very happy for it after the fact. It happened a little earlier than I hoped. I was 28 when I moved to San Francisco, and I felt like I had a few more good years of not sleeping in me. And then now I don't sleep at all because I'm in my 30s and I have small children. And so there's a combination of having crazy nightmares and 2 a.m. wake-ups with night sweats and also having small children. So look forward to that, women in your 20s. And this whole time, I was doing work that I was really into and happy with. I did this project for Starbucks. I had done a ton of wine labels for this winery in Willamette Valley, Oregon. That's amazing, called Mahonia. I did a couple covers for Dave Eggers and some other stuff for 826. And I had this huge project with Penguin Books called Penguin Drop Caps, where I did 26 titles. And it was crazy. I had to read like 6 books at a time, and it took a year and a half to get the project through. It was just bonkers, just tons and tons of lettering work. I worked on Moonrise Kingdom during that period, but it was still just so difficult to sort of balance out like what is work, what is life, like who am I, because I now have time to like actually, be introverted and look within rather than just having the next project come along that really is helping to define who I was. And then in 2015, I had my daughter, and so she's now 3.5. But anybody that has children in the room, shout out to parents. Anybody? Yeah? High five. Woo! But yeah, work life suddenly turned into this. And my typical workday before children was basically working 14 hours or so a day on and off, which I was fully happy with because I was like, what else am I going to do? Go to a bar every night and drink? That seems unhealthy. It's way more healthy to work all the time. And now my typical workday is basically between 6, sometimes 8 hours. And it's a very, very, very different situation. And I feel like I don't see enough examples of people that are doing interesting things in the world. Not that all of my things are the most interesting, but I'm working and you guys are here to see me, so I feel like that's validation that I'm doing something interesting. And I just feel like I don't see a lot of examples of people talking about how they don't work a million hours, how they can work 35 to 40 hours and still feel like they're doing enough and still feeling like they're doing fulfilling work. And I feel like I'm in a position in my life where I can do that and know that even if it turns away certain kinds of clients, I think it's really important that people know that you don't have to be working 80 hours a week in order to be a successful designer or illustrator. And I know that I'm in like a position of privilege based on the work that comes to me and whatnot, but I still feel like it's a hill I'm willing to die on now, understanding what it means to sort of balance these two things together. And so more power to all of you people that don't want to work 80 hours a week and still want to make good stuff. I took a plane ride today, and my book comes out tomorrow, so I'm a little emotional. If I get teary, that's not my fault, it's the stage. So around this time, there was a bunch of stuff that sort of happened. For one thing, I was getting a lot more like big projects, and the word NDA became a really big part of my life. And so it seems like it would be very exciting to get all of these huge projects, but the problem with it is that there's very, very long timelines, like between 1.5 to 3 years before things kind of go out into the world. And during the duration of that time, you're not allowed to talk about them with anyone, including the internet. So my Instagram account from like 2015 to 2016 looked a lot like this, because everyone's like, well, you could always work on personal projects. And I was like, tell me when I'm supposed to do that, And so my Instagram got kind of taken over by my daughter, and I kind of freaked out because I started getting emails like this, where it was, hi, Jessica, I don't know if you're taking on work right now, but I have a project that I think you'd be great for. So this happened 13 months after my daughter was born, and I started working when she was 3 months old. So that means that for 10 months, there was a lot of people that weren't contacting me because they just thought I was still on maternity leave. And I have been able, this was what she looked like at the time. She was pretty cool. She still is, but she's very complicated now. But it means that for every, nice email that I was getting from an art director, that was just being a little bit overprotective of my time and schedule and a little too caring about it. There were tons of people that weren't contacting me directly. And I saw this happening, if you had asked me if sexism was prevalent in the design industry when I was 28, I would have been like, are you kidding me? They want me to be on stage all the time, probably because I'm a lady. Sorry, dudes, it's great. But through this, I sort of saw directly by seeing, guy friends that I had that were also fathers going through it and not dealing with any of these assumptions or any of these oh, so you still have your studio? Why don't you work from home? It's so much easier and you could save the money. No one's asking that of men as designers. And I don't hold anything against men, we all should be able to live life how we are. And I feel like nobody has discriminated against me in an obvious or real way. It's just been in these sort of assumptions and allowances around what they presume I want to do with my time and my life and how I'm running my day and my work life comparatively. Like my studio mate, Eric Marinovich, who's awesome, he was getting calls the day that his wife went into labor and I heard him on a phone call being like, well, we're going to the hospital today, and the art director was like, but the sketches aren't due for 3 days. And I was like, no one would ask a woman that, no matter how, gung-ho she was about working immediately after birth. And it's not that I think that it's healthy to assume that people are willing to work immediately after birth. It's that you need to give them the opportunity to say no. So if that opportunity isn't presented, there's no way for people to actually direct their life how they want. Their life is being directed by how other people assume their life should be directed. So it's really important for men to be super visible about their fatherhood. I want to see all of your baby pictures as well on Instagram. And for women to get out there and make it known that being a mother is not a terrible thing. So during this time, something happened that I did not know about, really that I didn't know about until after my son was born, which was that I had postpartum depression, and it totally came about in a really super random way, insidiously 4 to 5 months after my daughter was born, and again, the same way with my son. And it manifested as crippling anxiety, the teenage anxiety that you had where you would be like, I feel like I said something weird to Shannon, And then it would just loop through your head all day long for or a week long or whatever. And it can be very difficult to be productive when you have that going on. And it's also really hard. Anybody that's dealt with postpartum knows that you have these two or one or whatever beautiful little people in your life, and you just you can't appreciate any of it because you're just not inside your body the whole time. And so during that time, that's when the question of who am I happens a lot for people. I didn't have a major identity crisis when I had my kids because I felt like I could still be me while also having them, other than the fact that I have to curate my Instagram finally and have it not just be a reflection of my real life, because if it was, it would be pictures of my weird removed toenail and me at the dermatologist and la la la. So now people get to see the idealized version of me on the internet and a little bit of the real stuff. And I was doing all this work that I was interested in. My work got, much more concise and less illustrative. But with this NDA issue, with just the Instagram thing with all my kids, and then the fact that lettering started as me and a couple other people, in terms of people that were known of my generation of lettering, and then it grew and it grew, and then all of a sudden I had to sort of figure out who am I, where do I stand in all this, how do I get back the work that I was doing before that I've lost because people think that I'm a stay-at-home mom half the time. And whenever you get to these points, you need to really do a bunch of self-assessment and ask yourself, what are my strengths, and what are my weaknesses? What are the things that I can uniquely bring to the situation that someone else that has more talent than me or more time than me or whatever cannot bring? And then how do I leverage those strengths to really do the work that I feel like I was put here for, or the thing that I can do better than everyone else, or the thing that will give me the most fulfillment and have the most impact? So if I were to make a really small list of strengths and weaknesses, because everyone knows that we have way more of both of these things than we can list on a single page, these were some of the things that came up for me. I'm super decisive to the point where you can come to me when you are choosing between 5 couches, and I will tell you which couch to pick, and you will have no regrets. / I will have no regrets. You might, but I will not, because I'm decisive. I'm a really good communicator. One of my favorite things in the world is to explain something that is a complex thing in a simple way. I love it. It's one of the things that drove a lot of my early website projects, Don't Fear the Internet and things like that. I just get so pumped about finally, having that click moment of knowledge when I'm learning it, and I just want to share that with everyone. And so communication and people skills and, sharing learning is really important to me. And then I'm really good at starting things and really terrible at finishing things. And I know that about myself. And I was telling some of the folks over here that I had met that I'm one of those people that's a really great first date. When we meet each other, I'll be this is it. We're in it forever. And then but I'm like that with every person. So it gets really horrible for people that are not like me. But it makes it so that every time I start a project, I just get so effing psyched about it. I'm just in. And as long as I can bang it out really quickly, I am just my own best hype man. I can get it all done. And it's only when it's a really long project that I start to sort of start wiggling around and not being able to know what to do with myself. So I knew that logos could be a big part of my future because they, and my present, because they utilize a lot of these skills. And doing logo work for larger clients really involves a lot more experience than younger designers can have usually, because so much of it is just about establishing trust and being a really clear communicator. And one of the things that I know is that being a logo designer is not being a branding studio. And what I did not want to do was to be a branding studio. I think it's, a lot of people's idea of what it means to be a successful designer is like you're a solo designer and then you grow your team and then your team gets big and you take on bigger projects and all of a sudden you're running a 50-person studio and everyone's like, and then you win all the awards and get crazy big clients, la, la, la. But that's not what I wanted to do for myself. I really like working for myself. I feel like I have moved more towards artist and less designer these days, which is weird because it's not something I would have owned a long time ago. But doing big work while staying small has been a huge priority for me. I want to be able to do ambitious work, but I want to not have to hire 1 million people to help me make that work happen, which means that I have to be really real with clients and real with myself about what my role should be on a project. I really need to know what my limitations are, and I need to know when I need to delegate out and when I need to, bring other people in that are going to do the work that I can't do or don't want to do. And what this really means is doing big work while staying flexible so I can spend more time with my kids and more time working on self-authored projects, which are really important to me and which are very, very difficult to incorporate into a schedule when you're trying to make sure you're there for every breakfast and dinner time with your kids. So this idea of brand refreshes as being something that I could focus on, has been totally game-changing in my ability to take on design projects. So I've done a whole mess of them at this point, probably like 8 or 9, 10, something like that. Some that I can share, some that I can't. And it all started with MailChimp when I had redone the MailChimp logo, RIP, which is, the new one is very cool, and I'm super into it. Way to go, Collins. But the first one was near and dear to my heart. And when I had posted the work to my website, I posted like little before and after pics so that people actually knew that I didn't design the original logo, that I was working on this update. And people went totally berserk for this because I think a lot of logo designers don't show a lot of the process behind the work that they do in a more public sphere. They'll do it on stage at a conference, but they won't do it in a way that clients could see or understand. And then I kept getting clients coming to me for the MailChimp treatment, which is really funny because I wasn't doing anything all that different than other designers could do for them. But I was just really involving them in the process and really educating them about what it is that I did. So now when I present to clients, I actually include this logo evaluation handbook at the beginning of my first deck, which explains every single thing that I'm going to walk through when it comes to redoing their logo. Stuff from big picture to letter form drafting, which goes into like very minutia detail in terms of, type stuff and letter style and stroke angle and all things that I've talked about in Skillshares and in my book and things like that. And then ultimately talking about vector drafting and what makes good vector drafting and what doesn't. And then I'll walk through with their logo all the things that I hope to address. And this sort of came about because Retail Me Not had hired me to do an evaluation before they actually hired me to redo their logo because they had to convince the CEO to redo the logo even though he was obsessed with it. And so by the end of it, I just had to put together a whole presentation about everything that sucked about their logo so that they couldn't unsee it. And then they had to hire me because they were like, "Ugh, we never knew that it looked like that before." And so it was jenis knew the things that were up with their logo and they knew things they wanted to correct and they were super great and super collaborative. And ultimately, the main goal was to make jenis not accidentally read as penis. Goal achieved. And for me, every single time that I do this kind of work, my hugest goal is to give the team, the company, the design team, an asset that is way easier to work with. That's all that I want is for everybody to have logos that are easy to design around. I don't think that all logos need to be fixed. I think that quirky logos are awesome, but what they shouldn't be are logos that are really difficult to design with or things that don't work together. In that way, that's why I'm super not mad about the MailChimp redesign, because they have always struggled with how to get Freddy, their monkey icon, to work with the logo type. And with mine that they had done, they had just decided to divorce them and that they would use them separately, but I know that they had been trying to combine them for so long. And that's why I can't get mad at all about the fact that they ditched my logo for a new logo, because they finally were able to marry those two things that they were really hoping to marry for a long time. And I couldn't figure out why this work felt so good. It feels really good to cash checks, I will tell you. And it also feels good to do work that's very utilitarian. Like, I love being useful. Like, being useful is one of the core things about the work that I do that I love. Like, if you were like, Jessica, why don't you make a bunch of like pillows that say love on it? They'd sell like gangbusters. I'd be like, ugh, it just seems like a waste. They're going to end up in the trash. But then, like, if Crate & Barrel contacted me and was like, let's make a love pillow, I'd be like, filling a need, let's do it. All about it. And so it's like the utilityness, but then also, you know, when I did the Enneagram test, I was like, oh, I'm a helper. I've incorporated all of my helperness into the way that I do these logo projects, which totally changes everything about my perception of like why they're important to me. Because they're important to me because I get to utilize a really, really specific skill set that I have, which is like this very, very nerdy typographic knowledge stuff that not everybody has. And it's very easy to forget how deep your knowledge is about a subject when you don't preach about it all the time. You know, like we take for granted just how much we know about, you know, so much about design and type, even just like technical things about using Adobe programs and things like that. And it's not until you start educating someone else about it that you understand how deep your knowledge runs and how the time that you have spent acquiring that knowledge has been worthwhile. Because you get to really look into someone's face and see them light up about the fact that you taught them that thing. And it's crazy. And so I feel like all of these personality tests, you know, like from things like Myers-Briggs, which are very science, to things like tarot. If you guys, I didn't bring my tarot deck with me, but if anyone has one, I would totally do tarot readings with you. I feel like all of these things are so useful for just having a framework to ask ourselves questions about ourselves and to confirm or deny things that we already know to be true. And understanding who you are is just outrageously important, and it's really difficult to get to it without having some sort of framework or without having a therapist or without having something to make you actually sit down and question and take time to investigate yourself. And most of us, when we're living that like insane workaholic life, you know, when we're just working 90 hours a week, we don't have time in our schedules to actually, you know, look within and to think about those things about ourselves. And it's asking those questions that guide us to making the right choices in our life instead of letting the choices be guided by, you know, whatever comes our way. It can feel really exciting to just let your calendar be, you know, just to go with the wind of whatever client is coming into your inbox. And I need to have a little bit about that because I do feel like when I try to set my own goals, I don't set them far enough. And I think a lot of us are guilty of that. You know, we set goals that seem achievable instead of the far-reaching ones because the far-reaching ones seem crazy. And it's when I don't have goals that the far-reaching stuff lands in my inbox, and that's pretty cool. But if we rely entirely on that, then when we have these life disruptions, when we decide to like take a step back and work less, when we set more boundaries on our lives, we aren't able to have those like cool, crazy happenstances in the same way that we were when we were just open to everything in the universe. So figuring out a framework to figure yourself out is just so important. So now when people ask me, you know, who I am, it's a way more complicated answer than a design illustrator or a lettering artist or whatever. And I'll lead with that if I'm at a conference or something. But if you met me in real life, you'd probably not know from first meeting me that I was a lettering artist. I would tell you everything else about myself. And I think it's really important to understand that no matter which thing defines us now, it's not the thing that's going to define us forever, and that whoever we are in this moment is not who we're going to be in 5 years. So even if you think about setting goals for yourself, set goals for yourself that you're amenable to changing depending on what your life circumstances are. And, you know, just sort of craft the life that you can have in the moment, like depending on the deck of cards that you've been dealt, not what you feel like is the life that you should have based on other paths of success that you've seen. And it's only through actually understanding who we are that we can ask ourselves, what do I truly love to do? Because what you truly love to do is probably like, you know, do some sexy job, get some recognition, cash some checks, the end. But that's not necessarily going to be the thing that fuels you forever. And you have to actually understand what motivates you at your core in order to choose the thing that you want to do, the way that you want to spend your time, that's going to, you know, be long-lasting and be something that you can do for the rest of your life, hopefully, you know, being malleable along the way. And so if you ask me now, like, what do I truly love to do, I can break it down into these sort of 3 basic things. I love to draw. I've always loved to draw. ever since I was a little kid. If people ask me, like, how did you become an artist? I'm like, I don't remember a time in which I was not. I was just the kid, I was the easy kid that sat in the corner and drew all day. But for that reason, I did not read books until I was like 24. And it's fine. You know, it just meant that I had a very specific set of things that I was interested in for most of my life, but it's something that's always been a passion, and I always foresee it being a passion, and it's at the core of what I am. And when I find that I'm not doing enough actual work, when I'm not actually drawing and making things with my hands, that's when I really start to fall apart, because it's such a meditative act for me. You know, like a lot of people meditate, a lot of people figure out, do yoga, do things to calm their mind. And for me, drawing has always been that thing for me. And so that's also one of the reasons why when I think about growing a studio, it is the absolute opposite of what I would want to do right now, because it just takes me away from the work. It turns me into a manager of designers instead of a designer. And there's nothing wrong with that, because managing is teaching, my second thing that I love. But if I wasn't drawing every day, I would be a very weird, cranky person. And teaching is another core of who I am and what I love to do. Not everybody loves to teach, and you don't have to love to teach. I think that teaching can be very fulfilling for some people and very exhausting for other people. I'm one of the people that it's very fulfilling for, and that I don't get as exhausted from it as other people do. So I try to incorporate it as much as I can into my work and into my life. And then making people happy, like this was a debilitating thing as a young child, because I had the like really bad people pleaser gene, and I still have it. You know, when I read articles about like, you know, women being like too nice and la la la, it just resonates a little bit too hard. And it's something that I have to contend with, where I have this need to make sure everyone in the room is happy. I just threw a book party in San Francisco for my kids' book, and it's like the most amazing, like it's a very fulfilling thing for me to do, and also my worst nightmare to throw a party for myself with a room full of people, because then suddenly I'm putting myself in charge of like 100 people's happiness. So like this could also be very debilitating. I hope you guys are all cool. Raise your hands if you're unhappy. Nope, don't do that. And but making people happy and making sure everyone, you know, everyone that I can make happy is something that I struggle with personally, but also can fuel me in really positive ways. And then another thing that's sort of a core belief that I have, and a way that I really live my life, is really believing in ripple out impact. So some people are big thinkers, right? Some people love to sort of dream about the future 100 years or 100 years down and figure out what they could be doing now to impact that future. And I am not a big thinker in that way all the time. I can do it, but it is a huge struggle for me. I'm not a 10-year planner or a 5-year planner. I'm a Tarzaner. I like look around for the best thing that's close to me, and I grab it and I just keep going forward. And when it comes to having impact on people and on the world, I really do believe that the small things that we do in our daily life have the potential to have an enormous impact on the world at large. I mean, I just think about the interactions that I've had with like random people on the train where I was having a shitty day and someone like gave me a compliment or like was just nice to me in a circumstance in which they didn't have to be. And it like completely turned my day around. So I really like to think about that in terms of how I interact with people on the internet, in terms of how I interact with people in real life. Just knowing that like we all have the potential to be like a really big positive spark in someone's day, in someone's week, and in someone's year. And it's like really empowering when you think about that. And it also works in the reverse where, you know, if you feel like being shitty for a day, you can have a real negative impact on someone depending on how fragile they are that day or whatever. And so this idea that we all have more power than we think we do is really important to me. And so a project that really sort of brought this all together, which I'm sure you guys have heard me internet about many times now because it's been like 3 years in the making. But I wrote and illustrated a children's book called Tomorrow I'll Be Brave, and it comes out tomorrow, which is very exciting. And I'm going to be doing a signing for it later after this talk at 6:30, along with all the other book signings that are happening. But it really gelled together so much of what I'm interested in, and it brought me back to this place that I hadn't visited in a long time, which is working as an illustrator. For whatever reason, I had basically abandoned my life as an illustrator when I went into lettering. You know, like my lettering started off as being super illustrative, and it eventually just got less and less illustrative as I went along. And I think I did it because I felt like people needed to know me as a letterer. They needed to understand that my identity was as a lettering artist. But I didn't realize it, that 8 years had passed since I had done any illustration, any narrative illustration. And that's like a crazy feeling where when I was like 22, I knew I was going to be an illustrator. That was what I was going to be. Before I got hired by Louise Feely, I was going to be a freelance illustrator. That was what I was going to do. And then over time, it just got weaned out of my work. And to come back to it now, after all this time, was really uncomfortable, but also really fulfilling. I felt so rusty, but it felt like it also felt really exciting to do a thing that I felt very unpracticed in. I'm a very risk-averse person, and I end up taking on projects that I know that I can knock out of the park. Part of it is just because I'm a people pleaser, and I want to make sure that all my clients are happy, and I don't want to take risks while I'm on their dime. But it's also just because that's just at the core of who I am. I'm just not the person that's going to go skydiving. And I need to figure out ways to insert more risk in my life. And in this case, it was about being way more emotionally attached to a project than I had been in years. I am so emotionally attached to this project, and I know it's going to bite me in the butt if I get some crappy reviews from people. But I also feel like being vulnerable is always good, and putting yourself out there is always good, and it's always a good place to grow. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about how it came to be. So when my daughter was 9 months old, we read to her all the time, and I started noticing that bedtime books for little kids, there were sort of these master categories. There was the Goodnight Objects category, which is all based on Goodnight Moon. Does anybody have one of those Goodnight Cities books? Goodnight San Francisco. And they're all terrible. They're terrible. And there's just a whole slew of books like this that are just Goodnight Random Objects. Goodnight Moon is good in its own right, whatever. I guess it's good. Someone wrote a really good article about why it's bad. And I wish I had a link to it in this slide because it was hilarious. But again, people see one idea of a successful thing and they just run after it and try and repeat it. The other category would be bedtime routine reinforcement books, which if you have a 2-year-old, all you're trying to do is make sure that 2-year-old brushes her teeth. You're just Elmo brushes his teeth, let's go brush our teeth. And every night you're just now Elmo drinks water before bed, and now he goes to the bathroom, and now bed has happened, bye. And so those books are cool, but they always have to star some beloved character. If you made up a character for a bedtime reinforcement book, it would be not a hit at all. It always has to be Daniel Tiger or Peppa or Elmo or whatever. And the last category that I saw there being a lot of were these parent cry books, which were the books that your mom bought you to make sure that you knew how intense being a parent was emotionally. And so there are all these and then you grow old and die and your child moves on, and no one reads these to their children because children can't be interested in them. But you start reading, you're 1.5-year-old picks it out to read for the night, and you get to page 3 and you're and so I was it feels like there's a lot of room to make some new stuff within the bedtime book area. And then also one of the things that I realized, I was terrified of making a kid's book before I had kids myself. Not that I think that should keep you away from doing it if you're interested in it, but because I'm so risk averse and I don't like to do things if I have to turn it into a research project, and I don't turn it into this oh, I'm just taking the knowledge that I've already acquired and figuring out how to funnel it into something productive. So once I had my kids, I felt like I had the ability to actually make kids books. But then also once I had kids, I realized that there is a bottomless pit of need for children's books. So if you have an idea for a kids book, make your kids book. Put it on Kickstarter. Even if you have 600 books at your house, everyone is bored with them and they need more books. So it is definitely an area where you're just oh, another lettering book? Nope, kids books, lots of need for that. Please keep going. And I went about it in like a very, logic-y, scientific-y way, sort of. I was really passionate about the idea of making something that was really encouraging for little kids, but that also didn't just like be like, go forth and do stuff, and didn't teach them about like what happens when you don't do those things. So I knew that at the core of this, it was going to be about encouraging kids, but also helping them deal with the fallout of not achieving their goals, sort of introducing self-forgiveness as something. And when I was thinking about, what to push people to do in terms of like how to encourage them, I was like, I need to just, if I'm going to make this into sort of like a lettering and illustration hybrid, I need some good words to draw. And so I ended up finding this list on MIT's website in their like deep archives by just Googling list of positive attributes. And it's much longer than this. This was my short list of things that I had compiled that I thought that would like somewhat apply to kids and parents. And then I narrowed it down from there for this book. And I actually have another book that's going to come out next year that's called Tomorrow I'll Be Kind, which they're going to announce tomorrow through Penguin. So yeah, which uses different words. But I wanted to pick stuff that felt like very action-y and very, very much about like just improving your own life. So the premise when I sold the books to Penguin was that the Tomorrow I'll Be Brave is all about ways to improve yourself just for you, and Tomorrow I'll Be Kind is ways to improve yourself for the benefit of others. And so these were the words that I sort of narrowed it down to, and it sort of alternates between just illustration spreads and then these big lettering illustration spreads. And, it's a really, you guys will see the book if you go to the bookstore and get it and come get it signed today. But the most important part of the book are the last two spreads, which sort of are a little rundown of all the things that I hope that kids will try to be, which is tomorrow I'll be all the things I tried to be today: adventurous, strong, smart, curious, creative, confident, and brave. And if I wasn't one of them, I know that it's okay. But tonight I'm very sleepy, so now it's time to rest. Tomorrow I'll be all these things, or at least I'll try my best. And so that was sort of the very last bit of it, was just having this point of reflection of I will try more tomorrow, I will be a better person. If I fail, it's okay, because there's always another time to try. And when I did some logo work for Oddfellows, and this was the logo that I ended up doing for them. And at the time, we did sort of a half trade of just like, oh, well, here you could pay me a little bit, and they didn't want to pay the full fee, so they're like, we'll give you some motion work at some point. And I was like, yeah, sure, that'll be cool. And my book was only at like this figuring out color mapping stage. It was really early in 2016. And then 2 years later, I finally had the book, ready to send out to the printers and stuff. And I contacted them to be like, hey guys, what do you say we make an animated trailer? And so I ended up being able to work with this like amazing studio to make the animated trailer for it. So I'm going to give you guys a little behind the scenes of how that got made, because I don't actually know how animation works until I worked with them. And I am like fully in awe of motion graphics people. But, being a person that works entirely in vector, I thought for sure it'd be like, oh, just bring this into After Effects and just like willy-nilly make things move around a little bit. And they were like, well, one, we could do that, but it'll look real puppety. And I was like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And they were also like, you have some stuff going on in your illustration that doesn't really make sense in terms of like where the direction of the legs are going, and we're going to have to figure out how to fix that. And I was like, thanks for pointing that out to me now that the book is at the printers. So they do a lot of cell animation for their work, and it's something that they're known for. And so when they came to me and were just like, so I think we should do the trailer as cell animation, I was like, how does that work? And they're like, we draw it over and over again. And I was like, that makes sense. That's how I imagined it, but thought computers did some work now. And so they put together these slides for me when we presented at TypeCon to sort of show the processes that they walk through for how they actually make some of this stuff happen. And one of the reasons, like, this shows really clearly of like why cell animation was necessary, because look at the way that the sword just sort of blends to speed it up. And that's something that if you look into, like, you can find like Tumblrs and stuff of Looney Tunes where they show like the duplicate animations of them trying to make things move really quickly. And it's like a still shot of an animation, and like the character has 11 heads while they're, you know, moving really quickly. And it's something that as a designer, I've definitely done this, where I probably have driven motion people insane by like slowly scrubbing through the thing and being like, the eyes are a little weird right here in second 13. And they're like, just never do that. But it just builds on itself over and over again. And they keep adding new things. And then they figured out how to make that leg work, which they were very proud of. And then the thing that's really awesome about collaborating with people is that they do things that you didn't even think about. Like they took the little heart that was on the shield and warmed it up when the dragon blew fire at it. And I was like, that's so dope. And then, of course, as soon as I saw this, I was like, we're going to make a Netflix show, guys. Let's go pitch it. Which, I don't know, if anyone here works for Netflix, you know. But no, it's just so magical to see your work move. You know, it's just very, I'm such a 2D person. Like, I don't think in the third dimension. I don't think of things moving. So it's like, was very, very magic to see things moving around. And it was also so awesome. I feel like everything that I do is a collaboration with people. You know, like I collaborate with different people all the time on things, but it's in such like a anonymous, short-lived first date kind of way. You know, like when clients hire me, it's of course a collaboration every single time, but it's way less of this like everybody scheming together, you know, this meeting of the minds where we all got together not for the purpose of like a client thing, but for like a real passion project. And I got to cash in like all my chips for this project. I did some work for my friend Olga Bell, who's a musician. And I did this album cover for her a few years ago and reached out to her to be like, hey, can you do some music for my book trailer? And then all of a sudden I had this like superstar cast of like crazy animator plus friend that's a musician. That's also amazing. So I'll show you guys the trailer now, in case you haven't seen it.
Tomorrow I'll be adventurous, strong, smart, creative, confident. Tomorrow I'll be brave.
So, yeah. Thanks, guys. And that was my daughter as the last voice and all of her little buddies as the other voices. And so they all are like, that's Nuri, that's Twyla, you know, every time they see it. So no matter what, I have at least like 5 or 6 tiny fans of the book. So hopefully many of your tiny people / grown people also like it. There will be a book signing today outside of the Max bookstore during the welcoming reception at 6:30. And then tomorrow I'm doing an event at the Last Bookstore in case any of you, for whatever reason, decide to not see Beck. But anyway, thank you guys so much for coming. It's so great to see you.